Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Isaac. Before we get started, I just want to point your attention to our virtual schedule where you can find out about more programming like today. You can access our virtual schedule at www.jclibrary.org. We also have a YouTube channel and Facebook where you can find out about more programming like today. Today, we have an author talk with Kiernan Ryan.
Kiernan Ryan is a professor of English, language, and literature and head of department at Royal Holloway, University of London.
Thank you for being with us and welcome.
My pleasure, Isaac. Great to see you.
So my first question is, there's been a lot has been published on Shakespeare. Can you talk a little bit about what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah, you really need to justify writing another book on Shakespeare these days, don't you? It's a good question. Well, for years, Isaac, I've been teaching Shakespeare and Shakespearean tragedy in particular. And throughout all those, well, several decades, I must say, I've never found any critical work. I've found some really good, helpful stuff, of course, but I've never found anything that really did justice to what I see as the revolutionary imaginative vision that powers his plays, powers these titanic masterpieces. Nothing that does justice to the urgency and immediacy with which they speak to us today, speak to us indeed more urgently and immediately, I think, than they could ever have done to Shakespeare's audience and readership in his time, in the late 16th, early 17th century. So I thought it was about time I pulled together all my ideas about the different tragic plays and about Shakespearean tragedy itself, and tried to weave it together into a coherent argument that had a stab, at least, at doing justice to what I see as the thrilling and moving and transformative potential of these magnificent works of dramatic art. The trouble I found really with previous criticism, I'm going to be very grossly generalized here, just to be brief, is that too much of it, especially in the last 4 decades, Shakespearean tragedy has suffered in the last about 40 years, since the 1980s, in academia at least, from what they call historicist criticism, from teaching the tragedies and reading the tragedies too much, I think, as if they were museum pieces, as if they could only speak of the past from which they sprang, which of course just locks them back there in the distant, remote, past 400 years ago, away from us. And however fascinating and interesting historically they might be, it prevents those plays from speaking to us now, as also contemporary texts. They, in other words, in their concern to enlarge our understanding of the historical context in which the plays were written, they've blinded themselves and blinded, I think, lots of generations of students, I must say, through this, what I call really kind of arid antiquarianism, this kind of purely retrospective critical vision of the works, they've blinded themselves to the degree to which these plays are out of step with their time. Their vision is out of sync with their time as well. Of course, the plays are rooted in the world and the language of the time in which they were written, but they also have this extraordinary ability to reach forward to us as we reach back to them, and have things to say that are prophetic, that anticipate things that have happened centuries after him, which is why Shakespeare is really almost unique. I think he is unique amongst the dramatists of his day, 400 years ago, in the fact that his plays have gone on inspiring operas, symphonies, more novels, more modern adapted plays, movies, TV series, all over the world, cultures all over. Think only of Romeo and Juliet. We were all reminded of that with the Oscar for West Side, the Oscars that West Side Story, Spielberg's refilming of West Side Story just the other week. I think 400 years on, the play is still speaking now as if it were our contemporary. Absolutely extraordinary. And even Shakespeare's greatest contemporary dramatists like Ben Jonson and John Webster and Christopher Marlowe, for goodness sake, nobody reworks their plays like that. None of their work, even at its greatest, inspires such an extraordinary range of cultural creativity. It's absolutely extraordinary. So we need something that can do justice to both the pastness of the plays, if you like, to their past significance, and also their capacity to generate present meanings that are out of step with and ahead of Shakespeare's own time. I'm not the first person to say this. A century or so ago, 2 centuries ago, rather, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the famous poet who wrote Kubla Khan, and the name of the poem is escaping me now, the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, that's right, of course. He was certainly in my view, and not just in my view, probably still remains one of the greatest critics of Shakespeare. And he said of Shakespeare, while he registers what is past in his plays, he projects the future in a wonderful degree. Isn't that wonderful? And your great American philosopher, essayist, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was channeling Coleridge, who influenced him a lot, also said of Shakespeare, he is as unlike his contemporaries as he is unlike us. Isn't that beautifully said? He's not really, he's just out of kilter with, out of step with his own time and the minds of his time, but also still now, centuries later with us. So I want to find a way of writing about Shakespeare's tragedies, of interpreting them, that did justice to both that pastness and that semantic potential they have to generate fresh interpretations that you can demonstrate, that make those plays come alive within this extraordinary actuality and pressing urgency right now. And the other thing, there's another way of looking at another way Shakespeare's tragedies have typically been taught and still are taught widely in schools, certainly here, and I wouldn't be surprised in the States as well, which is it tends to see the protagonists, the main characters of Shakespearean tragedy, as being, the tragedies are caused by the fact that they have a tragic flaw. You know, basically, put it crudely, it's their fault everything went wrong. Hamlet delays too long, you know, carrying out the revenge that the ghost of his father had enjoined him to take, you know, against his brother who murdered him. And therefore the whole chain of deaths and murders, including his mother's and Ophelia's and Hamlet's own, are all the consequence of Hamlet having this psychological flaw in his system, you know. Or King Lear, the whole tragedy is caused by the fact that he rashly divides up his kingdom in a kind of moment, an impulsive moment, it would seem, an impulsive moment of vanity, and divides and banishes his good daughter Cordelia and divides the kingdom between the 2 evil daughters, hence catastrophe. Othello, oh, of course, the tragic flaw of jealousy. Yeah, it's all his fault. He had this flaw of being too jealous, and so therefore the tragedy is his fault. Well, you can see this reduces these plays. This reduces them to kind of anodyne, insipid morality plays, you know, in which the characters are punished, yeah, for not conforming to the expectations and moral codes of their day. Well, that seems to me, you can see how on the surface that might seem to have some credence. You might give that some credence on the surface. But when you look at these complex, rich plays and you look at them in close detail and examine the language, the poetry, the theatrical form, what you see, of course, is that it doesn't come across like that at all. What Shakespeare's doing, what he's showing is that the tragedy is the product of systemic injustice, by which the characters are shaped. They're shaped by their world and time. It's not that they're innocent victims, but they are, the world that made them that way is complicit with what they do. And you can't isolate the blame and the fault of the tragic. You can't isolate the cause of the tragedy and pin it on Hamlet or Othello or King Lear or Macbeth alone. The whole society stands indicted in Shakespeare for placing that human being, that originally innocent human being, in such a predicament in the first place. That's the point. That's where it gets really exciting, where the plays become, as I would say, revolutionary. And by revolutionary, I mean not in some narrow sense that they're all, you know, up on the barricades in some naive political sense, but rather what I mean is that they are written in such a way as that they pose a problem that could only be solved by the complete transformation of the society that produced that problem in the first place. Nothing less than the transformation of society as such from the ground up would suffice. Hamlet famously says, "The time is out of joint. Oh, cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right." He never says, "Oh, what cursed spite, I've got to revenge my father's death." No, the only thing, the problem he sees is the whole society has to be changed. This place which is weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable. All the uses of this world he feels alienated from. All Shakespeare's tragic protagonists, it seems to me, have this in common, that they all find themselves in a role, trapped in a role, in a place, and in a time to which they don't belong. They all become...
For students and readers who are going to read your book,
yeah,
how can they approach writing about Shakespeare and doing it justice if they don't have like a full understanding of all of his work?
If they don't, that's, I think they can. I don't think they need a full understanding of all of his work, actually. I really don't. I think you can work it out. In fact, I would go so far as to say you can really zoom in, home in on a particular speech, and you'll find that tension there, you know. And perhaps later in the session we can look at something and see that happening, that tension between the way things were, the way people thought and felt and acted in his time, which he represents on the stage, and the perspective from which he invites us to look at and judge and evaluate what they're thinking and saying and feeling and doing. And that perspective is ahead of his time. So it's put it another way, you find at the heart of these plays Shakespeare dramatizing the way things were in his world from a standpoint that is well grounded, I would say, in a kind of radical egalitarianism, a sense of what human beings have in common as opposed to what divides them. It's the divisions in his society, as in our society, that produce the tragedy, social, sexual, racial divisions that produce the tragic conflicts and disasters, but they're evaluated from a perspective which is committed to the possibility of creating a community of equals. So this egalitarian idea, I think, is the really radical, revolutionary thing in Shakespeare, which we can certainly come back to. But I don't think, to answer your question, Isaac, I don't think you need to worry about, oh my goodness, I've got to get a whole sense of the range of plays. No, just move in on any one you like that takes your fancy or that you happen to be studying at school or at college. It's fine. It's all there. He gives you everything you need to know inside the world of the play. I think too much Shakespeare has been spoiled for too many people, including me when I was a schoolboy, by this tedious contextual background study that you all have to do, this preliminary, extraneous spade work to find things before you can even get in there and understand it. Much better to go and, see if you're doing Macbeth, go and watch the wonderful movie with Denzel Washington on now. Just watch that. It's there. It's all there. It's all you need. And then you can come out from that and get the book and study the text and then go into those wonderful speeches he has, and that he delivers so superbly. And then you're there. Doesn't matter if you've never read another Shakespeare play. Shakespeare didn't write them like that, thinking, I hope everybody's read all my other plays before they come and see the next one.
Right. I want to ask you another question.
Yeah.
Your book confronts A.C. Bradley's analysis of Shakespeare. Can you talk more about why your book gives a more profound understanding of why Bradley's point of view is flawed?
Yeah, I must preface what I say with expressing my admiration for Bradley. In many ways, my book is a kind of homage, or homage, as you guys would say, to Bradley's work. I mean, it hasn't survived and remained in print for a century for no good reason. Right. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. And there are passages in it which are unsurpassed, like his analysis of the motivations, the supposedly enigmatic, inexplicable motivations of Iago. He's just brilliant at clearing away all the nonsense and rubbish that people have heaped on that. He gets right into it and he says, this is what's motivating. It's dead clear. Look, and he argues it through close analysis of the language. That's what I love about Bradley. Close reading of the poetry and the theatrical strategies of the plays. Everything's there for you. Shakespeare gives you everything to understand it. So having said, how much I admire his study of Shakespeare, it's really extraordinary. On a profound level, I'm absolutely at odds with what he's saying, because for Bradley, Bradley's too close to the tragic flaw idea. In other words, he'll isolate the protagonist, Macbeth or Hamlet or King Lear, and he treats it as though he treats them as if it's their psychological constitution that's the key that will unlock the source of the tragedy. In other words, he separates them from the social and cultural context, the ideology, the assumptions, the attitudes that they've internalized as a man growing up in that kind of world in that time. Whereas Shakespeare never separates his protagonists from the culture that created them. Yeah, he always says you've got to take that into account too when you're judging this person, because the guilt is shared between them and the world that they were unconsciously, involuntarily controlled by. That's the brilliance of it. I don't think many people have really seen this yet. Shakespeare already understood how you can become like a kind of sleepwalker, like Macbeth, sleepwalking to murder Duncan, in spite of everything in him saying, don't do it. The milk of human kindness inside him is saying, don't do this. It's going to kill you. You'll never sleep again. Macbeth hath murdered sleep. Yeah. But Shakespeare really understood the way you can be so gripped by prejudice, bigotry, misogyny, ideas of masculinity and manhood, individualism, for mine own good, all causes shall give way, me first, look out for number one, hierarchy, climbing up the ladder, all that stuff gets inside you and makes you become somebody that you're not, somebody, and it stifles that more generous, kind human being latent within you, the one full of the milk of human kindness. It turns out an extraordinary, beautiful, handsome, brilliant, intelligent, eloquent man like Othello into a murderer of the only woman he's ever loved. Yeah? But he does that because he's been shaped by, he shares the same misogynistic ideas about women and sex and marriage as Iago does. Yeah, so he's both a victim in a sense as a black outsider in that culture, but at the same time he's also complicit through his misogyny, his sexism, with his own destruction and the death of himself and his wife. That's incredibly complicated. So Shakespeare, it's never a simple question of bad society, innocent individual victim. No. It's much more morally complex than that. That's the really interesting thing. And I think that Bradley doesn't see that. Bradley thinks the problem lies, however sympathetic the portrayal of the protagonist, he thinks it lies, the answer lies, the explanation lies with our understanding of the isolated individual mind and character of the protagonist. So he can't go further and say Shakespeare is critiquing the world in which that tragedy took shape, in which the protagonist finds themselves trapped. Yeah. So that was the reason I wanted to take issue with Bradley, but at the same time, learn a lot from him and borrow from him. And above all, I wanted really to underline by example, coming back to your question about how should people studying Shakespeare set about it? Well, I think he's a wonderful example, and I hope I'm giving quite a good example too of how the secret is close reading of the text. Don't worry so much about the background stuff. You can always get that from the introduction to the play and all that. Just read the play and understand the language, and the rest will take care of itself. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about your title of the first section, The Birth of Shakespearean Tragedy, Henry VI. What is the significance, and how and what can readers take away from reading this section?
Yeah, that is a really good place. That's one of the most original things in my book, if I say so myself, because what I wanted to argue was, you see, a lot of academic critics think that really there is no such thing as Shakespearean tragedy. In other words, there isn't, you can't recognize a kind of family DNA resemblance all the way through, whereas I think there is. And so you can understand it in a way they say, no, you should really just take them on their own, one at a time, Titus there's 9 main ones that everybody recognizes. Titus Andronicus, going through in chronologically, Titus Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, the early ones. Then the big four Titanic masterpieces, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, and then the two late wonderful ones, Antony and Cleopatra, another love tragedy, and Coriolanus, and some other ones that we could talk about. We don't need to worry about now. But as I read through them and the others, it seemed to me, and as I've studied them and taught them, it seems to me that there's another thing I agree with which I have in common with A.C. Bradley, is that there really is such a thing as Shakespearean tragedy. There's a line of vision going right through them, and like the spine running right through every single one, and it's rock solid. Not only is it running through them, but in his very first plays with which he made his name and attracted the envy of the so-called, the educated university dramatists who mocked him as the upstart crow beautified with our feathers, because they were outraged that a mere actor from the sticks could write better than they could. Drove them crazy. They couldn't believe it. He was just more naturally gifted than them. And it seemed to me that if you go back to those Henry VI plays, with which he started his career and, as I said, became a really like an overnight sensation, effectively. In those plays, you can see already the prototype at the heart of it, in the person of Henry VI, the prototype of King Lear and Hamlet and Timon of Athens, and that's very obviously, and less obviously, but just as strongly, all the Shakespearean protagonists. Because in Henry VI, you have a king who doesn't want to be a king and hates the whole idea of sovereignty and kingship. It repels him. He'd rather be dead. He'd literally rather be dead. Hamlet comes along and does the same thing later. Now, what is all the use of this? Even before the tragedy starts and the ghost has appeared, he's had enough of the whole world as it is. The whole thing stinks because everyone's so corrupt and disgusting, even his own mother, for God's sake. Huh? Absolutely, it's really quite remarkable. So right from the start, Shakespeare, the upstart crow from the sticks, already has a deep empathy with these alienated, disenchanted outsider figures who aren't just uncomfortable and wishing they had a solution. They're characters who can't find a solution for their way they feel inside the status quo, because the status quo is the frigging problem. It's what's producing their malaise, their misery, their unhappiness, their despair, their sense of having become a stranger in a world where they once felt at home. Yeah, and a stranger to the person they once were or thought they were. That's it. And you see protagonist after protagonist, Romeo and Juliet, two lovers who discover an egalitarian reciprocal love, a love based on mutuality. My bounty is as boundless as the sea, my love is deep. The more I give to thee, the more I have. For both are in. They discover this extraordinary, however fleetingly, utopian way of loving between a man and a woman, completely against the grain of what's normal in their society. Well, of course, they're completely out of step with it. They're strangers in that world. And you can find that Othello is self-evident, don't even need to make that point. And the same with all the other protagonists as well. King Lear discovers that he ends up expressing nothing but utter vitriolic contempt for being a king at all. So you can see that line going right back to the earliest play. It's really quite remarkable, and he's absolutely true to it. And the values that underpin those characters, the creation of those characters who feel so alienated and antagonistic to their society and its ethos. That rationale is explained in the other main character in those history plays, Jack Cade, the plebeian revolutionary. Right at the heart. So in the same play where he invents, brings together a plebeian revolutionary whose mantra is all the realms shall be in common. I mean, it's a communist cry. Yeah, we shall all be equals. And that's his battle cry against the aristocracy. And you've got a king who doesn't believe in sovereignty and kingship and wishes he was dead. Yeah, he said, no one's ever longed to be a king so much as I long to be a subject. What I'm trying to say is those two things go together right through his work. The egalitarian principles ideals, which form the basis on which he judges and evaluates his society, and also that the creation of characters who can no longer live at home in that world, which doesn't conform to those more humane communal ideals. And so you can see the seeds of everything that's in all the plays, tragedies that follow, come out of that early history play. I hasten to add, it's not a history, it's not a tragedy itself, but it's just got the tragedy in embryo, if you like. Yeah, just the beginning, the first little shoots of tragedy you can see there. It seemed to me that was a discovery, I think. And when you see that, you think, my God, he was like that from the start and right through to the end. And in Coriolanus, that's got plebeian uprising as well in it. He starts his career with revolutionary plebeian, popular revolt, and he ends the play with a popular rebellion. The play opens with fighting in the streets, people demanding food. Yeah.
I want to move to chapter 5.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read a little segment.
Oh, yeah.
You write, Hamlet epitomizes the refusal of Shakespearean tragedy to make complete sense in terms of its time because of the assumption and value that govern it are ahead of its time and ours. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Well, I suppose we've touched on it a little bit already, haven't we?
Yes.
It's that if we think of Hamlet, for instance, that is a perfect example of Shakespeare being out of step with his time. Mm-hmm. Because in most revenge tragedies of the period, the problem for the revenger, who has to carry out a revenge to get justice, is that the problem for them is usually, how and when do I do it? How am I going to get this revenge done? Shakespeare says, I'm going to write a revenge tragedy. And in this revenge tragedy is going to be a revenge tragedy with a difference, because in this, the revenger is going to be unable to carry out the revenge, and for reasons that baffle him too. Mm-hmm. He doesn't understand. In other words, he creates a situation in which the problem confronting the revenger can't be solved inside the world of the play as it stands. And to make it clear how radically different Hamlet is, he has two characters, Laertes, brother of Ophelia, son of Polonius, and he has the Fortinbras, who wants to avenge his father. Two characters who want to avenge their fathers, just like Hamlet. And they're completely orthodox, completely conventional. They have no problem whatsoever. They don't go around saying, oh, I don't know why I can't carry this out. It's not a problem whatsoever. They're completely men of their time. Their heads are completely circumscribed, imprisoned in the ethos of the world in which the society in which they find themselves. Whereas Hamlet is saying, what the hell's going on here? I hate being here in this world at all. The time is out of joint. In order to solve my problem, it's not a matter of revenge. It's a question of complete reconstituting society altogether. And so just the very creation of a character like that, like Hamlet, a disaffected intellectual prince who has more in common with a shrewd plebeian gravedigger, in the famous gravedigger scene in the graveyard, who finds there's somebody who's a kindred spirit with him, a kind of linking across the classes, two disenchanted, wry, cynical, both speaking that antic disposition, of quibbling, clever quibbling from below. So I think, so what I simply meant by that was that Hamlet really is a beautiful instance. I mean, the perfect example of Shakespeare being at odds with his world, being anachronistic, if you like, that's right. And literally for Hamlet, and for 4 centuries of critics have found Hamlet, I think the famous Harvard professor, one of the great legendary American literary critics, Harry Levin, described Hamlet as the most problematic play written by Shakespeare or any other playwright ever. But I don't think there's any problem at all once you realize that the the problem isn't with Hamlet, it's with his world. Because then Hamlet's inability to act becomes his virtue, not his vice. Who would want to act on the same terms of a world like that? If he did carry out the revenge, you know, in a conventional way, the way Laertes or Fortinbras would have no problem in his place doing. If he did do it, the world would still be the same afterwards. He'd just be another Claudius. He'd just be replicating the status quo, reinforcing it, because they all believe in that revenge code too. But he doesn't believe in anything this world does or thinks or recommends or obliges one to do. Yeah. So it's throwing the world that made him into question rather than pinning the blame just on the protagonist, Jeff.
Can you read a passage from the book that helps guide the reader to your central argument?
Yeah, I'll tell. I put it on a separate text so I can bring it up and still you can see my aging features still while I go through it. Let me just shorten that. There we go. So you can still see me, yeah?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Okay, so I thought I'd read a bit from a very short piece, just a few minutes from my chapter on Othello. I hope this might help to clarify the kind of thing I'm trying to do with these plays. So anyone who doubts that Shakespeare's greatest tragedies were written from a visionary standpoint far ahead of his time need only think of Othello. The play is so well known that it's easy to forget the audacity of Shakespeare's decision to transmute Cinthio's cautionary tale of a doomed mixed-race marriage into a heartbreaking tragedy. Centuries before the issues the tragedy compels its audiences to confront became as urgent and ubiquitous as they are today, Shakespeare forged in Othello a critique of racial and sexual injustice, which is more powerful now in the 21st century than it could ever have been at the dawn of the 17th. The tragic chain of events commences with the elopement of Othello and Desdemona. The fact that they're forced to elope makes the illicit nature of their relationship in the eyes of Venice immediately clear. But in their eyes and in Shakespeare's eyes, there's nothing illicit about their love, to which they regard themselves, and the play regards them, as fully entitled. Undeterred by the paternal wrath and widespread disapproval they're bound to incur, Othello and Desdemona act as if a black man from Africa and an upper-class white woman from Venice have every right to fall in love, marry, and be left to live in peace as husband and wife. They act, in other words, as if they were already free citizens of a truly civilized future, instead of prisoners of a time when racial prejudice and sexual inequality are so pervasive that even their heroic hearts are tainted by them.
Thank you for being with us, and see you back soon.
Yeah, thank you ever so much for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always, Isaac, and a delight to see you again. All the best.